What's up everyone, Colt Capperrune here. Thank you so much for stopping by for another video. I really appreciate it. The last time I wore this shirt in a video, I got like 100 comments, people being like, how could you believe someone that wears such a stupid shirt? Well, I brought it back just for you haters. So we all like low end. We want subs in our car, we want to feel that kick and feel that bass. It's what makes us want to dance, and it's just fun to listen to. When you're at a concert and that kick drum literally feels like someone's punching you in the gut, it's awesome. But is it actually a good idea in the studio environment? Well, that's what I want to talk about today, and if you stick around all the way to the end of this video, you should have a much clearer understanding on whether or not a sub is actually a good thing for your particular situation. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe tab so you get notified when I drop new videos. Also, give me a thumbs up on this one and drop me a comment and let me know if you have a sub, what kind of sub you have, or if you want a sub, or if you think whatever, just leave me a comment. Actually, all that stuff really helps me out. It really helps the channel out. With the more you guys interact with the content, the more traction the video gets, and the more traction these videos get, the more I can justify taking the time to create them. So get down there and drop a comment and give me a thumbs up and subscribe. It really means the world to me. So basically the question I'm trying to answer in this video is, should you use a sub? When is it appropriate to use a sub, and when is it not appropriate to use a sub? Because believe it or not, there are very specific cases where it's actually appropriate to use a sub, and there's some other cases where it's really not appropriate. So the first question to answer is, what do you actually do, and will a sub help you or hurt you? Now, a lot of people think that adding a sub to a monitoring system lets you hear into the low end better, and you might think that that would allow you to make better mixes and make your low end in your mixes better, but that's not always the case. So the first couple things I want to rule out is, if you want a sub because you just like to feel low end, cool, good on you, go for it. The second thing is, if you are adding a sub to impress your clients. This is a real thing in my opinion. You have clients come in to listen to mixes, or if you're trying to convince someone to hire you to mix or to produce, and you throw your previous work up on your system and it sounds awesome. Well, it's a lot easier to sell people that way when you're in that situation. So adding a sub is a cool thing for both of those reasons. Now, when you get down into like tracking and mixing and mastering, things start to change just a little bit. Now, in the tracking environment, if you want to really feel the power of some drums that you're tracking, and you really want to see if that floor tom's got that thunderous thing that you're after, a sub can be a great thing for that, regardless of how your room sounds and regardless of if it's a good thing when mixing or not. So, a really full range system can be really helpful in those situations. Now, moving on to talk about mixing and mastering, we need to talk about a couple other things before we nail down whether or not it's a good idea to use a subwoofer or not. The first thing is, what is your room actually like? How big is your room? How well treated is your room? So every room has an inherent frequency response, and you can Google a room node calculator. I'll try to find a good one and drop it a link in the description of this video. And basically, if your room is some sort of a square, you can input the dimensions of your room and it will tell you plus or minus the problem areas in your room. And what you'll usually find is your room has a room node, and it resonates real hard at 100 hertz, and it resonates at 50 hertz, which is the octave down, and 25 hertz, which is the octave down from that. And so depending on your room and the size of it and the shape of it, it might be just fine to use a sub, or it might be a really terrible idea. So the first thing you should do is take measurements of your room, width, depth, and height, and then look up a room node calculator and see a ballpark where your room is actually sitting. The very next thing is, how well acoustically treated is your room? Now, there's no secret that I talk about acoustic treatment all the time on this channel, because I genuinely think it's one of the single most important things in mixing and mastering music. But if your room is not treated very well or not treated at all, a subwoofer is, generally speaking, a really terrible idea, because all you're doing is pumping more low end into a room that can't handle the low end you already have. And so after you've looked up your room nodes on the calculator, the very next thing I would suggest is taking some actual measurements. This software you can find online is not really terrible. I actually got some software with my event Opals here that measures the room and gives you a pretty close idea of the frequency response of the room with these monitors. And so that would be the very next thing that I did before adding a subwoofer, is figure out the actual response of your room and if you need any bass traps. Now, most rooms have problems in the low end, especially the smaller they are. And so as a general rule of thumb, the smaller your room is, the worse of an idea a subwoofer typically is. Now, I got pretty lucky here with my room, and my room is 24 foot by 26 foot by 12 foot. And so it's a pretty good sized room, and I got real lucky with the dimensions in the fact that it's a really, really flat room, and I'm still not running a subwoofer. Now, that's not to say that I won't one day, but currently I'm not. Because whatever problems your room has in the low end, it's magnified times 10 as soon as you put a subwoofer in. And so you really need to make sure your room sounds really good, specifically in the like 200 hertz and down range before you add a subwoofer. Otherwise, you're hurting yourself more than you're helping. So you have a couple problem spots in your room and you figured this out. You've got some measurement software and you see a node at 100 hertz and 50 hertz, and you got to get that taken care of before you add a subwoofer, or at least if you already have a subwoofer, you should really consider taking care of this, and it will make your mixes translate so much better. So what do? Well, you got to build some bass traps, and there's a whole bunch of ways to do this, so I'm not going to get super into it, but you also need to figure out if you have the physical space to build a bass trap. So typically, the frequency response of a bass trap, how effective it is at a specific frequency, the bass traps get larger as the frequency gets lower. So if you have a real problem at 32 hertz, your bass traps are going to have to be enormous in order to actually make any difference at 32 hertz. And this is an area that you absolutely don't want to skimp on. If you're going to build bass traps, make sure you know exactly what frequencies you're building them for, and make sure they are big enough to handle those frequencies. Now, this is actually one of the very specific reasons why I went with these event opals, is because the low end on these is absolutely phenomenal without using a sub. They're almost flat down to 32 hertz. There's some other companies like Barefoot. Like, there's a handful of companies that make subs or that make monitors that are really, really flat down low. And so if you're in a room that has some issues in the low end, I would strongly encourage you to look into, well, first of all, look into acoustic treatment. Get your room treated, and if you can afford it, or if you can justify the space, build bass traps to handle your low end, regardless of if you're using a sub or not, regardless of what monitors you're using. Getting your room treated and as flat as you can make it is the single most important thing in mixing and in mastering. But I chose these monitors because they have a really, really full bottom end and they're really flat down low. And so you might consider getting a pair of monitors that is really flat down really low rather than adding a sub. There is something about adding a sub that introduces a whole bunch of new issues that running just monitors that go deep doesn't really introduce nearly as much. So the very last thing I want to discuss is that you should be focusing on the mid-range in your mixes anyway. This is something that I discussed recently in a video about if your mix translates in the car. Does your mix suck in the car? It's probably a shitty mix then. You can check that video out right here. And basically in that video, one of the things that I talked about in much more detail than I will here is that you should be focusing on the mid-range. And if you're really focusing on the mid-range, like 200 to 3K, 200 to 4K, chances are the low end is gonna sort itself out anyway. And so this illusion that we really need a lot of low end to hear what's happening down there, this is something that is not nearly as significant of an issue as a lot of us think. And I certainly was there once myself. I thought that the low end was everything. And it was when I kind of stopped worrying about the low end that my mixes started translating and sounding really good. But go check that video out. I'll put a link in the description to it as well. I am actually working on the concept for a video explaining how to mix with the mid-range, and I'll be real honest with you, I'm just not quite set up to do it yet. I gotta get some screen recording software, and I'm gonna have to get a little mixer so that way I can run out my interface and run a microphone from the camera with audio from Pro Tools, and I'm just not quite there yet. And as soon as I'm set up to do that, I'm gonna put a video out like that, and I'm gonna start doing a whole bunch more, screen capture, mixing tutorial kind of stuff. So make sure you guys subscribe, and make sure you hit the bell icon next to the subscribe tab. And again, drop me a comment and give me a thumbs up on this video. It really helps the channel out, and it really helps the video get traction. And the more traction these videos get, the more I can justify making them for you all. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Later.